There's a scene from the second selection where Kunigami proclaims that Shido is attempting the impossible by shooting with his back against the goal. Shido's response, as he makes the most insane shot in the series so far? Impossible? I don't know what that means. Who decides what's impossible? This is a key line in that it defines not just Shido's personal worldview, but also a crucial element of Blue Lock's philosophy more broadly. Basically, whenever there's a dichotomy between compromising and being realistic on the one hand, and defying the odds and resisting the status quo on the other, the narrative always seems to favour the latter, with Snuffy and Mick probably being the best examples in this series. So, going back to the match between Shido and Kunigami, this contrast in their conception about what is humanly possible serves as a baseline indicator that Kunigami's philosophy was lacking in comparison with Shido's. Kunigami imagines walls where Shido sees possibilities, and this is used as a shorthand to justify Kunigami's elimination from the Blue Lock program. So with all this in mind, let's turn to the introductory scene of the NEL's main antagonist. As he shoots Isagi's ball off course, he proclaims, "Ich heiße Kaiser und werde das Unmögliche schaffen." Warte mal. Okay, that's better. Hello, my name is Sean, and this video is sponsored by the Mikage Corporation. But there are some folks who are even more vital to the success of the channel than some evil corporation, and those are my wonderful patrons. So if you want to support me and help fund all my gorgeous custom artwork, or just want to get access to my weekly podcast where I give my first thoughts on the new Blue Lock chapter, do consider signing up. Back to topic. When Michael Kaiser makes his first appearance, he introduces himself as the one who does the impossible. And right from the get-go, this offers a critical difference with Shido. For Shido, there's no such thing as the impossible. He views the notion that some things are impossible as an artificial constraint that must be smashed to pieces. Kaiser's mindset, however, is very different. When he valiantly proclaims that he'll do the impossible, he also tacitly acknowledges that the impossible is something real, something that exists out there in the world. This is the tension at the heart of Kaiser's character. By the very act of trying to become a symbol of the impossible, he effectively consigns himself to a series of unnatural limits. So in this video, I want to show how Kaiser's struggle against the impossible both informs his own character arc and how it's used to shed light on some of Blue Lock's central ideas. This paradox is spelled out most clearly in the Ness flashback. In Kaiser's own words, the instant people believe in the impossible is when they learn to give up. It's a survival instinct to guard against heartbreak. But that's the way of weaklings. They kill themselves with the curse of impossibility. So when Ness and Kaiser pair up to pass the tryouts, they are said to have done so by smashing through the impossible. And note here that this is the mentality that is validated by the narrative as a whole. Again, think Shido, think Mick and Snuffy. However, Ness's backstory as a whole tells a very different story about Kaiser's relationship with the impossible. And here, I just have to gush about the very first meeting between Kaiser and Ness, because it's to date one of my favorite pages in the entire story. Now, it's really important to note that in terms of framing, we're witnessing the encounter from Ness's point of view. Ness, of course, is the kid who is captivated by the supernatural, the inexplicable. But during the tryouts, he couldn't make the magic happen, with the rival competitors refuting his fantasies in the same way as his parents had done so many times before. So as he's knocked to the ground, he's right about to give up, to acknowledge that he was wrong, that there's no such thing as magic. But then he looks up and sees his teammates standing tall above him, asking him whether he believes in the impossible. From the page's very composition, we follow Ness's upward gaze towards Kaiser at the very center of the page, with rays of light beaming towards him, and then the heavenly expanses above. To put it differently, this page is laid out the way it is because we're viewing the world through Ness's eyes. From his perspective, this is like an invitation, an affirmation of his belief in magic. And that's why Kaiser is at its center, at the center of the world as it were, when seen as the perfect embodiment of everything Ness holds dear. He's the figure who taught him that nothing is impossible, that there is a radiant sky above the fences of the football field. But what adds even more layers to this scene is that 20 chapters later, we get to see it unfold for a second time, but now from Kaiser's POV. And just look at the difference in the angle. When focalized through Kaiser's eyes, the camera is aimed towards the ground, with giant fences in the background. There are no endless horizons to be seen when Kaiser mentions the impossible. In his case, this concept keeps him trapped, caged, with no visible escape. So, let me segue to the ultimate symbol of Kaiser's predicament, his blue rose tattoo. Let's start with the narrative Kaiser himself spins about it. In his own words, the blue rose is an embodiment of something that can't arise naturally, and its impossible existence stands in marked defiance of the divine order. Yet, turning back to the central paradox of Kaiser's notion of the impossible, I can't help but wonder whether the very act of etching the seemingly impossible object on his skin doesn't somewhat undermine its symbolic currency. Hasn't he devalued what the rose represents by bringing what was formerly impossible into existence? Like, the symbolic potency of this flower is exactly that it can't be found anywhere in the world. Once it has been brought into existence, it's just a thing that's there. Put differently, its existence offers a constant reminder of the conceptual divide between what's possible and what isn't, at least in Kaiser's mind, while also firmly aligning Kaiser with that what apparently hadn't been impossible all along. And this is an idea I'll return to later in the video as well. Also, I know this is a bit of a cheap shot, but we're literally being shown how some random teenager can facilitate Kaiser's transformation into this ostensibly impossible, unattainable object with a bottle of dye and a pair of scissors. Apparently, you too can become a symbol of the impossible for just €50 tops. Long live consumer capitalism. But as you'll probably have already realized, the irony of this tattoo runs a lot deeper once we're shown how Kaiser actually got it. Now, it hasn't been spelled out explicitly what transpired, but the framing of what comes before and after strongly suggests that it was part of a heavily asymmetrical power dynamic. Michael was quite literally held captive before the agent who scouted him and forced to obey his every wish if he wanted to escape his abusive household. This is a point in his life where he had virtually zero agency, and him getting a tattoo under these circumstances, to me, seems more akin to the branding of cattle. Moreover, the manga right now shows us a very specific rose, namely the one that had haunted Michael's father. And I'll have a lot more to say about that in a moment. So, to put it simply, from this perspective, the tattoo takes on a very different meaning. It's as if Ray is telling his protege, "You're under my control now. Escape is impossible." But we can take this even further, because this impossible rose has been an ever-present companion since Michael's earliest childhood. Right after his birth, his mother abandoned her family, leaving his father only a single rose that he carefully displayed all these years. I think this all goes without saying, but in the language of flowers, roses are the quintessential symbol of love. But rather than a full bouquet, Michael's mother gifted her lover only one single flower, just as she had only deemed him worthy of her affections for a fleeting moment. Moreover, for the father, his inability to let go of this deeply symbolic object lays bare that underneath all his hatred and malice, he holds a deep-rooted yearning for a love that will never be his. And yes, this is very much an instance of so father, so son. In other words, for Michael's father, this rose represents his own unattainable desires that held him captive and led him to ruin his life. It's his own symbol of the impossible. And so, when Michael himself is forced to carry this image with him at all times, it serves as a harrowing reminder of how his life is still shackled by this family curse. A life without freedom, hope, or love. That's what his blue rose truly stands for. So now, let's take this from Kaiser's past to his behavior on the pitch. As said, Kaiser is obsessed with this notion of becoming a symbol of the impossible. And that's why he's constantly making shots in the most impractical conditions. In the BM tryouts, his shot course is blocked by 3 defenders, and yet he manages to thread the needle and score with pinpoint accuracy. In the Mannschwein match, Kaiser charges straight into the middle of the defense, right where all the Mannschwein players have clustered together. And yet, he manages to single out the one spot where none of them could block his shot. Similarly, in the Ubers match, he boldly declares to Ness that he shouldn't worry, since nothing is impossible for him. And then, he makes more than true on his promise. The Ubers block his shot course, and even push and tackle him as he attempts to shoot. And yet, he scores with a spectacular bicycle kick from these seemingly impossible circumstances. This is of course all incredibly impressive. Yet, at the same time, Kaiser's goals come across as massive gambles that regularly involve honestly unnecessary risks. Now, since I'm sure I'll get this comment if I don't bring it up at some point, all this is evidently a manifestation of his ego type, as he's someone who performs best under restrictions. As the manga explicitly states, one's ego type alone is in no way determinative of someone's success on the pitch. It just means that different players require different circumstances to reach their peak performance. However, this doesn't mean that there aren't better or worse ways to leverage your innate disposition, nor that the same ego type can't manifest in different ways among different players. So what I guess I want to say is here that I'm gonna avoid chalking up everything I discuss in this video to Kaiser's ego type, because to me, that feels like a bit of a reductive approach that doesn't offer substantive insights into his unique character. In any case, as the arc progresses and his teammates and rivals start to catch up to Kaiser's abilities, he finds himself increasingly obsessed by a desire not to just show results, but to do so in a way that positions him as this symbol of the impossible. So that brings me to his performance in the PXG match, where we finally see Kaiser fully unravel. The context, of course, is that Isagi has effectively usurped the team from Kaiser's grasp, and so Kaiser finds himself needing to prove his value more than ever. There are a few details towards the start of the match that I find quite fascinating in light of Kaiser's penchant for seeking out the most limiting circumstances. At the very beginning, Kaiser once again finds himself facing off against 3 defenders, the optimally suboptimal conditions in which he thrives. This is the Manshine match and the BM tryout scenario all over again. Yet, this time around, Rin ruthlessly shuts down his shot. So, from the very get-go, Kaiser is shown struggling to bring about the impossible in the way he always did before. But even more striking is that we next find Kaiser and Ness on the reverse side of this dynamic. After PXG's first goal, the duo sets out to seal off Charles' pass course to Shido by 99%. Charles then does exactly what Kaiser always did himself: weave the ball through these obstacles with pinpoint accuracy. And what really jumps out to me about this scene is how surprised Kaiser and Ness are about Charles' attempt, despite this being the prototypical Kaiser-style play. So, in a sense, the roles are now in reverse. Kaiser and Ness have become the defenders who prevent any reasonable person from taking the shot, whereas Charles is the one who challenges the impossible. All this shows how Kaiser is rapidly losing his footing as symbol of the impossible, and this leads to a scene that truly threatens to put the nail in the coffin. In his desperation to reassert himself, Kaiser devised a new impossible weapon in his Magnus shot. Yet, as he himself acknowledges, it requires virtually impossible conditions to pull this off during actual play. And what's highly significant here is that when he tries to pull it off, despite not meeting the criteria to make it work, Kaiser frames this as an impossible challenge that he needs to overcome. And so, for the first time in the story, he fails to bring about the impossible. And that sees him sink down to his lowest point in the entire story. What I find especially interesting about Kaiser dubbing such feats impossible challenges, not just here but also elsewhere in the match, is how the term evokes a central element of Blue Lock's conceptual framework. As we've been shown time and again since the third selection, reaching the flow state requires a player to engage in so-called challenge-based concentration, with conditions that induce neither boredom nor anxiety. Rather, you need to face an objective with the optimal level of difficulty. So, if Kaiser sets his target on something he actually believes to be impossible, that should prove counterproductive in reaching his peak performance. This is exactly what unfolds when Ness of all people tells Kaiser to stop panicking and making impossible plays. You know, the one guy who wholeheartedly believes that nothing is impossible for Kaiser. At this stage, anxiety has fully kicked in as Kaiser finds himself unable to embody his ideal any further. And it's no coincidence, in my view, that right at this moment, Kaiser's rose tattoo comes into focus. First, we see a brief montage of everything that held him captive, ending with his father's rose. And this segues directly to a panel of Kaiser with his tattoo on full display. Same thing a few pages later when he's fully enveloped by the fear of returning to his past state. Once again, there's the accursed rose to underscore how he's perpetually shackled by his struggle to overcome the impossible. This applies more broadly as well, by the way. Pay attention to when we get to see the tattoo, because in many cases, that's a serious indicator that the story is exploring Kaiser's ongoing struggle. This is figurized perhaps nowhere better than when Kaiser finally reaches the next stage and scores his most breathtaking goal to date. And in the afterglow, we get one of the most iconic pages in the story. So let me dissect some of the symbolism here. Kaiser pulls down his shirt to reveal the blue rose in its full glory, while being showered by rose petals. This is it. He has overcome the impossible. Yet, at the same time, he's grasping towards the heavenly light, the gods above, while his feet are firmly planted on the ground. The implication here is that being an embodiment of the impossible isn't a state, but a process. He hasn't become the impossible, nor could he ever truly seize that title for himself. After all, once you do something that was previously deemed impossible, you'll simply have proven that it was actually feasible all along. And with that, the goalposts for an impossible shot move ever further away. If you're fixated on something that by definition can never be attained, all you can do is keep reaching upwards, keep on defying the odds, over and over and over again, until you eventually succumb to the impossible. This is perhaps best exemplified later in the match, where Kaiser takes on a new impossible challenge with his penalty. But right when he had outwitted the opposing goalkeeper, Loki sees the ball's trajectory and charges in. A fraction of a second later, PXG's master effectively supplants Kaiser as the one who pulls off the truly unimaginable. And that's underscored by Loki's taunt that the shot that had previously overcome the impossible is positively sluggish in the face of a new obstacle. It's quite significant, I think, that this scene makes up part of the sequence where Isagi realizes that Kaiser is not a genius, but rather a talented learner like himself. In particular, this becomes apparent when Kaiser, just like Isagi before him, decries the unfairness of God seemingly dividing the world into haves and have-nots. God's favor, by implication, being enjoyed by France's divine sprinter, a player blessed with speed beyond human comprehension. But let's circle back to the Ness flashback once more, because that adds in an extra layer of irony. Back then, Kaiser characterizes the blue rose as a symbol of rebellion against God. So, with the Loki scene, Kaiser is reminded how far he's away from bringing about said rebellion, with God simply mocking him for his efforts. In the end, the lesson that gets pounded into him is that he'll never fully overcome the impossible. Even if he achieves it once, he'll just find himself falling short sometime down the line. That brings us to the ending of the PXG match, where Kaiser eventually loses out to Isagi. And while there's a lot to unpack among the reasons why Isagi came out on top, there's one that I want to hone in on for the purposes of this video. Kaiser's misguided belief that it's not possible for Ness to change. His old words to Ness have now come back to haunt him. The instant you convince yourself that something is impossible, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. In other words, if he couldn't fathom the possibility that Ness would shed off his perceived limits and evolve, it's his own fault that this goal became impossible. I made this video because the tension between Kaiser's high-flown ideals and the layers upon layers of trauma and insecurities that underpin them is for me the most compelling part of Kaiser's character. I find true poetic beauty in his eternal struggle to actualize an ideal that can, by its very definition, never come to fruition, even if it leads him to spiral ever further into extraordinarily toxic and self-destructive behaviors. And it's deeply touching to me that a philosophy that emerged from rejection and malice can inspire lifelong love and admiration in others, even if the man himself believes that what he seeks is always out of his grasp. To me, that's the tragedy of Michael Kaiser. As always, thank you for watching. Also, I'm well aware that this is not a comprehensive Kaiser video by any means. That was also never my intention with this project to begin with. If you want more of my thoughts about Kaiser though, I've got a few recommendations. I've discussed his character in my video on self-love, in my video on the NEL as a coming-of-age story, and in my recent PXG analysis. I've also got a lot to say about his relationship with Isagi in my video on the queer elements of Blue Lock, and in an admittedly somewhat dated video about the concept of rationality. But before I call it a day, I have to thank the figurative Nesses to my Kaiser, albeit one who can hopefully better appreciate her sentiments. I'm of course speaking about my €10 patrons, Jesus Cujo, Local Sass Boy, Patrician Pat, and Orangey Legend. I really can't stress enough how much your support helps me keep the channel out of the red. So, until next time, slán go fóill.